In a quiet suburban town, tucked between rows of identical houses with trimmed lawns and white fences, lived a man named Edgar Hill. He was the shoemaker on Maple Street, a man no one really knew but everyone recognized. People passed his workshop every day, hearing the soft thump of his hammer and the faint hum of his sewing machine. His shop was small, with dusty windows and a wooden sign that simply read Hill's Shoes. There was nothing unusual about him. He was polite, reserved, and always seen wearing the same brown apron smudged with glue and leather dust. To the neighbors, Edgar was simply the man who fixed their shoes and nothing more. His life seemed ordinary. He opened his shop early in the morning and closed it just before sunset. He rarely left his house, except for brief trips to the grocery store or hardware shop. Even then, he kept his head down and avoided conversation. People thought he was shy or maybe just preferred to be alone. Some children whispered that Edgar was strange. They said he never smiled. But their parents brushed it off, telling them not to bother the man who always returned their shoes perfectly repaired. Over time, people stopped noticing him altogether. He became just another quiet fixture in the neighborhood. Behind his house stood a tall wooden fence covered in thick layers of ivy. No one ever saw inside. The gates were always closed, secured with a heavy chain and padlock. On rare occasions, Edgar could be seen carrying bags of soil or rolls of leather through the gate, quickly shutting it behind him. No one asked questions. No one thought they needed to. Strange things began happening in the town, but no one immediately connected them. A delivery driver never returned from his route. A teenage girl vanished while walking home from school. Later, an elderly woman disappeared after her daily walk. Each case was treated separately. Each family searched desperately. Posters went up. Search teams gathered, and the local news covered the stories with urgency. But after weeks with no leads, the cases slowly went cold. Life in the neighborhood continued, and people tried to move on, though unease lingered in the air. Occasionally, a foul smell would drift through the neighborhood, especially on hot days. Some people complained, thinking it might be trash or a dead animal somewhere nearby. The scent seemed to come from Edgar's property, but when health inspectors briefly visited, Edgar calmly explained that the odor was from the chemicals he used to treat leather. His explanation made sense to them, and they left without looking further. No one pushed the matter. More disappearances followed, but they were always spaced far enough apart that no pattern seemed obvious. A young man on his way to visit a friend never arrived. A woman who regularly jogged past Edgar's street vanished one morning. Each time, the community reacted with shock and grief, but each time suspicion drifted elsewhere. Continued his work in silence, as if untouched by the tragedies happening around him. He mended shoes, stitched worn leather, and added new solace, his hands moving carefully, methodically, as if he had no other concerns. Some customers commented on his incredible attention to detail, the perfect fit of their repaired shoes. They praised his craftsmanship. Never knowing what else those careful hands had done, the town gradually settled into uneasy acceptance. People locked their doors sooner, warned their children not to walk alone, but no one truly looked at the quiet Shoemaker. He had lived there for years, always in the background, always unnoticed. What danger could possibly come from him? No one imagined that behind the tall fence, beneath the ivy, and under the quiet soil, a dark secret was slowly being buried. One victim at a time, the yard behind Edgar Hill's house was a place no one ever entered. It was hidden behind tall wooden fences, with thick ivy crawling up the planks, covering almost every inch. The fence seemed to stand like a silent wall, separating Edgar's world from the rest of the town. People rarely thought about what was On the other side? The children in the neighborhood often wondered, but none of them ever dared to find out. When their balls accidentally landed in Edgar's yard, they would abandon them, choosing to lose their toys rather than step onto his property. There was something about the yard that made people uneasy. Even though they couldn't explain why, for years, the gate to the yard remained locked. Edgar kept a large chain wrapped around it, with a rusted padlock hanging in the middle. From the street, it was impossible to see what the yard looked like inside. Some neighbors assumed it was probably just overgrown weeds or piles of leather scraps from his workshop. Others thought Edgar used it to store old tools and broken furniture. No one ever saw him inviting anyone into his backyard. He worked alone, lived alone, and no one questioned him. He had always been that way. Over time, the backyard seemed to develop a strange reputation. The smell was the first thing people noticed. On certain days, especially when the sun was high, a sickly, sour scent would drift through the air, faint but enough to wrinkle noses. People blamed it on the glue and chemicals Edgar used for shoemaking. They thought maybe he was burning trash or using old, spoiled materials. Some even suggested it was a dead animal buried under the soil, but no one ever complained seriously. They simply accepted it as part of living near a shoemaker's workshop. One day, a city maintenance worker was sent to inspect the underground water pipes in the neighborhood. He was supposed to check the ground conditions near Edgar's home. As he walked along the side of the house, his boots sank slightly into the dirt near the fence. It felt oddly soft, almost like it had been recently dug and loosely packed back in. Curious, the worker tested more spots along the fence. The soil in several areas felt the same. He made a note in his report, but when he returned to his office, the paperwork was quickly buried under more urgent tasks. No one followed up. Meanwhile, Edgar began expanding his workshop. Over the years, he quietly built extra storage areas at the back of his house. Large wooden crates would arrive at his property, and neighbors sometimes saw him carrying heavy sacks through the gate late at night. They assumed he was ordering new materials for his shoemaking business. It all seemed harmless. No one imagined that each crate, each bag, and each tool was connected to something far darker. Even as Edgar's property changed, his daily routine remained the same. He still worked quietly in his shop, greeting customers with brief nods and short answers. He continued to collect old shoes from the community and return them in perfect condition. His attention to detail never slipped. Some even said his work was better than ever, as if he had found new passion in his craft. But Edgar was not driven by passion. He was driven by something else, something that kept him digging new holes in his backyard when no one was watching. Years passed, and the yard behind his house became a silent witness to the lives that ended there. The soft earth, the sealed fences, and the heavy chains kept the secrets buried. No one asked questions, and Edgar gave no reason for them to. The shoemaker's yard remained just a quiet, hidden corner of the neighborhood, holding its dark truth beneath the surface. The yard behind Edgar Hill's house had always been a place of mystery. Hidden behind the tall wooden fences, it became something of a ghost in the neighborhood, a place that was always there but never truly seen. Over the years, the fence became so overgrown with ivy that it blended into the background, almost as if the yard was trying to disappear. The gate remained chained and padlocked, its metal rusting but still firmly shut. No one ever saw it open. It was as if Edgar had sealed that part of his life away from the world. Children in the neighborhood grew up hearing stories about the shoemaker's yard. Some believed it was filled with piles of broken shoes and rusted tools. Others imagined strange animals living inside, kept as secret pets. Despite their curiosity, none of the children ever dared to climb the fence. They said the air around it felt heavy, and the longer they stood near it, the more uncomfortable they became. Even the bravest among them eventually left their toys behind rather than risk stepping into Edgar's hidden space. Occasionally, neighbors would notice Edgar carrying large bags or boxes through his gate late at night. The shapes were hard to make out in the darkness, but they seemed heavy, and Edgar always moved with slow, careful steps. No one thought much of it. They assumed he was just throwing out old leather scraps or bringing in new supplies. After all, he was a shoemaker. What else would he need to carry? His business seemed to grow quietly over time, and the extra crates and materials made sense to those who noticed, but there were moments when something didn't feel right. The smell coming from the yard became harder to ignore. It wasn't constant, but when it drifted through the neighborhood, it made people pause. It was sharp, almost sour, and it clung to the air like something rotten. Some thought it might be trash, others believed it was from the chemicals Edgar used in his workshop. A few people complained, but each time an inspector came by, Edgar would point to his shoe treatments, his glues, and his dyes as the cause. The inspectors accepted his explanation and left. No one wanted to dig deeper. On one particular afternoon, a city maintenance worker was assigned to check the underground water system in the area. As he walked along the side of Edgar's property, his boots pressed into the dirt, which felt unusually soft in several places. It was strange because the rest of the street's soil was dry and packed tightly. The worker noted the odd ground texture and logged it in his report, but the file was buried under more urgent city matters and forgotten. Edgar's yard remained undisturbed, while the neighborhood's attention shifted from one missing person to another. Edgar continued building new sections onto his workshop. The new additions rose slowly, with fresh wooden walls and locked doors. Neighbors assumed he was expanding his storage, possibly to handle more business. What they didn't know was that these new spaces were carefully designed to keep certain things hidden from the outside world. Edgar never rushed his work. Each piece of leather was cut with precision, each sole stitched with care. He was known for returning shoes in near-perfect condition, his reputation for craftsmanship quietly growing. People continued to visit his shop, completely unaware of what he was hiding just a few feet behind them. The yard held its silence, the soft earth concealing what Edgar had placed beneath it. The fence, the chains, and the ivy kept the outside world away, and for years no one thought to look beyond them. The shoemaker's yard remained just another locked corner of the neighborhood, where the grass refused to grow and the soil was always ready to be turned. In the quiet records room of the local police station, stacks of old case files gathered dust, each one holding the story of someone who had vanished without a trace. Most were cold cases long forgotten by the public, but a young officer named Adam frequently found himself drawn to them. He was new to the force, eager to prove himself, and curious about the strange disappearances that had unsettled the town over the past 2 decades. As he flipped through the worn folders, something began to bother him. There was a pattern, faint but impossible to ignore. Adam noticed that several missing persons had last been seen near Maple Street. Some were delivery drivers whose final drop-offs had been in that neighborhood. Others were local residents who regularly passed through the area, people whose routines had been familiar and predictable until the day they simply vanished. The more Adam reviewed the files, the clearer it became that these people all had one connection. They had been close to the home of Edgar Hill. The thought seemed almost ridiculous at first. Edgar Hill was the shoemaker, a quiet man who had lived in the same house for years, who fixed shoes and minded his own business. But Adam couldn't shake the feeling that something was being overlooked. He began pulling more records, parking tickets, delivery logs, security footage from nearby streets. It took weeks of careful searching, but slowly, Adam pieced together the quiet steps that had led to each disappearance. It turned out that many of the missing had been near Edgar's home shortly before they vanished. Some had been seen on security cameras delivering packages to his address. Others had walked past his workshop at the same hour on the same day each week, their movements almost predictable. None of this had been connected before. The disappearances had seemed random, spread out over years, with nothing linking them together. But Adam's research showed they all shared something in common. They had all crossed paths with Edgar Hill. The deeper Adam looked, the more disturbing details surfaced. He found an old, forgotten report from decades ago about a house fire that had destroyed Edgar's childhood home. The report was thin, the investigation barely completed. According to the file, both of Edgar's parents had died in the fire, but their bodies were never found. Neighbors at the time believed the fire was an accident, possibly caused by faulty wiring. Yet one officer had written a small note at the bottom of the report suggesting the fire might have been set on purpose. That detail had never been followed up. The file was marked as closed. The possibility that Edgar's pattern of violence may have begun long before anyone noticed chilled Adam. If Edgar had truly started with his own parents, it meant he had spent years quietly perfecting his ability to hide in plain sight. His life as a shoemaker would have provided the perfect cover, always present in the community, yet invisible to most people. Adam brought his findings to his superiors. At first they were skeptical. Edgar Hill had never been in trouble with the law, never even had a parking ticket. But the more evidence Adam presented, the harder it became to dismiss. The overlapping timelines, the victims' last known locations, the missing persons all tied to the same small stretch of road there, were too many coincidences. Permission was finally granted to search Edgar's property. It would be the first time in years anyone had stepped beyond the locked gates of his yard. Adam felt a mixture of dread and determination as the plan was made. He didn't know what they would find, but he was certain that the quiet shoemaker had been hiding something. For a very long time, the buried clues had finally surfaced, and the soft ground behind Edgar's house was waiting to reveal its secrets. The day of the search arrived quietly. Officers moved carefully through Edgar Hill's property, their steps slow and deliberate, as they crossed the threshold of his locked gate. For years, no one had entered the yard behind his house. Now, with shovels, equipment, and forensic teams, they began to peel away the layers of silence Edgar had so carefully built. The soil was damp and soft, exactly as the maintenance worker had once reported. The officers dug cautiously, unsure of what they would uncover. It didn't take long before the first horrifying discovery surfaced. Beneath the surface, they found a body wrapped tightly in thick plastic sheets, carefully folded and sealed. The body had been buried deep enough to avoid detection, but close enough to suggest that Edgar never expected anyone to look there. Forensic teams quickly confirmed the worst. This was one of the missing persons from the cold cases. Encouraged by the find, they continued digging in nearby spots. With each new hole, the same chilling pattern appeared. More bodies, each buried with precision, each carefully prepared as if Edgar had taken time to ensure none of them would ever be found. Some were wrapped in tarps, others covered with sheets of leather stitched crudely like they were part of some unfinished product. As the grave count rose, the officers realized that Edgar's yard was not just a hiding place. It had become a personal graveyard stretching across nearly the entire fenced-in area. The soil had served him well, soft and easy to shape, allowing him to bury his secrets over years without interruption. Inside the workshop, the search continued. What at first seemed like an ordinary shoemaking space soon revealed something far darker. Behind a false wall, officers found a hidden room sealed tightly with a steel latch. Inside the cramped space, they discovered a collection of personal items, wallets, watches, jewelry, and small keepsakes that belonged to the victims. It was a collection that spoke to something more than simple disposal. Edgar had kept these items, stored them like trophies, carefully labeled and arranged. What caught the attention of the forensic team the most were the shoes. Dozens of pairs lined the shelves, each unique, each meticulously crafted. When investigators checked them closely, they found something deeply unsettling. Many of the shoes contained initials carefully carved into the inner solace. These initials matched the names of the missing people. It was as if Edgar had preserved a piece of every victim, not only in the ground but in his craft. The shoes were more than just products of his trade. They were quiet, lasting reminders of those he had taken. It became clear that Edgar had maintained his routine to perfection. He continued to fix shoes for the community, all while expanding his secret collection and his private graveyard. His entire world was split into two spaces: the public shop where he was the trusted craftsman, and the hidden yard where his victims rested beneath the soil. The horror deepened when the forensic analysis confirmed that some of the materials used in Edgar's custom shoe repairs had traces of human remains. The leather had been mixed with fibers and elements that could only have come from the victims' personal belongings, possibly even from their clothing. This detail unsettled the entire investigative team. It meant that the very people who trusted Edgar with their shoes may have unknowingly worn pieces of his secret. The evidence was overwhelming. Edgar's quiet life had been a perfect disguise. His shoemaking was not simply a job, it had been the mask he wore while carrying out his dark routine. The backyard graves, the trophies, and the shoes told a story more chilling than anyone had imagined. The investigation had pulled back the curtain, and the quiet shoemaker's world of silence was finally exposed, the town that once ignored. Edgar Hill now found itself gripped by the horror of what had been uncovered. News of the backyard graves spread quickly, sending waves of shock through the quiet community. People who had once casually visited his workshop now stared at his house in disbelief, trying to understand how someone so ordinary could have hidden something so monstrous for so long. The quiet shoemaker, who had walked among them unnoticed, had built a world of terror behind his locked gates. Edgar was arrested without struggle. He offered no words, no defense, and showed no emotion as he was taken away. His silence unsettled everyone. In the courtroom, he remained still and expressionless, never once explaining his actions or offering any insight into why he had done what he did. Psychologists, investigators, and journalists all searched for reasons, desperate to piece together a motive, but Edgar never spoke. His silence became part of the mystery that continued to haunt the town. As the investigation deepened, more disturbing facts came to light. Old records from other towns revealed that Edgar had moved several times in his early adulthood, always settling near places where people later went missing. The pattern was faint, spread over decades and locations, but it was there. It became clear that Edgar's acts had not started in this neighborhood. They had started long ago, possibly even with the fire that killed his parents when he was still a young man. The fire, once thought to be an accident, was re-examined. Investigators now believed Edgar had intentionally set the blaze, likely beginning his long and silent path of violence by eliminating his own family. It was a horrifying idea, but it fit the timeline. From that moment, Edgar had walked through life quietly, selecting victims carefully, always choosing people who would not be missed immediately. He had mastered patience, blending into the background. While building his private world of trophies and graves, what disturbed the community the most was the discovery that Edgar's work had touched nearly everyone. The shoes he had repaired, the solace he had stitched, and the leather he had handled were all now viewed with suspicion. Some forensic tests confirmed that materials connected to victims had been used in Edgar's repairs. People who once proudly wore shoes he fixed now felt sick, wondering if they had unknowingly walked in reminders of the missing. The thought of carrying pieces of his secret horrified the entire town. Even after Edgar's conviction, many questions remained unanswered. No one knew exactly how many people he had killed. The known victims were only those whose remains had been recovered in his yard. Some experts believed there were likely more, possibly from the other towns where Edgar had lived briefly. The full scale of his crimes might never be known. Edgar himself never clarified, leaving the final number a dark mystery. His house was eventually boarded up, his workshop abandoned, and his once trusted name became a warning in the community. People no longer walked past his property without quickening their steps. The smell that had once drifted from his yard was gone, but its memory remained, lingering in the minds of those who had lived nearby. The story of Edgar Hill became one that parents whispered to their children, a cautionary tale about the danger of ignoring what seems unusual. He had lived among them, unnoticed, quietly turning his home into a graveyard. The quiet shoemaker, who had been invisible for so long, was now impossible to forget. And though his house would one day be torn down, the soil beneath it would always carry the weight of the secrets he left behind.